Hello, and welcome back to the France Made Simple podcast, where I tell it all like it is, warts and all. Or, in the case of today's episode, verrucas, or verru, and all. Keep listening and you'll find out what I'm twittering on about today. Anyway, today's episode is another by special request. An Instagram follower got in touch with me and asked me to do a podcast about keeping horses in France. Now, I've been obsessed by horses since I was about 9 months old, and despite not coming from a horsey family at all, I think this is probably because my mum used to drive children out to go to their riding for the disabled lessons back in the UK. And apparently at the age of 9 months, I was kind of parked in my pushchair at the side of the indoor school, absolutely loving watching everybody on horses. And I think that's probably when the bug first hit. And it is a bug. A friend of mine's mum, who's a lovely old Irish lady, once described it as being like an alcoholic. It's an addiction, so it is. And I thought, yeah, that's pretty true, actually. So yeah, I'm definitely an addict when it comes to horses. And I grew up in London, and riding lessons were a kind of treat for birthday and Christmas and stuff like that. And because we didn't have a lot of money at all. But when I was about 13, I said to my mum, if I save up, can I buy a pony? Now, bear in mind that we lived in a flat in London at the time, and she said yes, never thinking that I would manage it or get there. But I got a job at a greengrocer's after school, because this was back in the days when kids could work after school or on Saturdays. And then I got a paper round at the weekends, and I'd get up on a Sunday morning at 4:30, 5 and lug all the Sunday papers with their massive supplements. I didn't know for years after that my mum, bless her, had sent my dad out with the dog to follow me in the dark just to make sure I was okay. Then I delivered weekly papers. Then I think when I was 15, I got a job in an old people's home after school, making cups of tea, cleaning them up, taking them to the loo. It wasn't pleasant, but it was more money for the pony fund. And then when I was 15, I managed to buy my first pony. And I remember it was £500, which at that point in time, you could buy a pony and a saddle for £500. And I bought my first pony, who was a grey 14-2 Connemara called Rebel, which appealed obviously to my rebellious teenage self. And I remember very distinctly when the owner kind of handed him over, my mum and I looked at each other at this pony on the end of a lead rope, kind of like, now what? But I learnt a lot along the way, and I was lucky enough to meet some really great people, one of whom is still one of my closest friends kind of 40 years later, and I learnt an awful lot from them and those people. So if you're listening to this, thank you, Lou. You know who you are, and you're still supporting me with my ponies and pony-like endeavours today. So thank you, Lou. Anyway, I've always managed to keep my horses somehow, even when times have been really tough, even when I was living in a tent with my 3 children in Brittany. I must be slightly insane or an addict, as Brian's mum would have said. And during the process of my separation now, I've had to move from the southwest of France, where I had my horses at home, and I've moved to Normandy, and I had to find a field. I was lucky enough to be lent one for the first few months. They're now on a kind of grass livery. So I don't have my own home, but I do have a really great livery set up with a really good guy. So yeah, it's a journey, as they say, and it's never easy when you've got horses, unless you've got oodles and oodles of money. But many people like me do kind of somehow manage to keep them on a shoestring. So obviously, if you've listened this far, you'll know it's a subject that I'm passionate about and I love chatting about. So when I got a letter in, I was delighted that we're going to be able to explore keeping horses in France in this episode. So the letter says that this lady is in Les Landes at the moment. No, they're outside Paris at the moment, around Fontainebleau. And they do love Les Landes, but they're worried it might not be ideal for ponies. She says, I kept horses in Andalusia for a long time, but my other half isn't used to the heat. So we're thinking north would be a better bet. We'd be happy to stay here around Fontainebleau, but unfortunately it's very expensive. So it's probably good to start with the question of where, and particularly in France, the climate, north versus south. Obviously, pretty much everywhere, the climate is becoming more and more extreme. And when we first moved to Dax, it was perfectly okay and perfectly feasible to keep your horses outside over the winter with no rugs. And then climate change meant that the winters started getting wetter and wetter, and I noticed the change. First of all, my old mare needed a rug, then she needed a better rug, then she needed a rug with a neck cover, then she definitely needed a field shelter, etc. Climate change is a factor to think about, and the north is also heating up in the summer, although it's obviously still not as hot as the south. The south can be much too hot in the summer. I used to have to get up at 5:30, 6 if I wanted to ride in the summer months. Literally, we had to be out by 6, or the flies and the heat made it untenable. So I would personally go for a temperate area due to hay availability, grass shortage, and just the general comfort of both yourself and your horses. Now, the next thing to think about is the regulations that are involved in keeping your horses at home, because obviously this is France, so everything is going to be regulated. So whether you've got one or several, whether it's a horse, a pony, a donkey, whatever, you are going to need to comply with the regulations that are in force. And these are basically that the animal must be identified by a microchip. We've moved on from the days of branding numbers on horses, luckily. Microchipped. You will need what they refer to as a carte d'immatriculation, which makes me laugh because it sounds like a car number plate, but basically the horse's passport. And you will need to fill in the paperwork, which is referred to as the conditions à remplir par un détenteur de équide. So basically, if you're going to keep your horses at home, you need to sign a piece of paper that shows you are kind of capable of doing that. Now, you will need to notify the IFCE, which we'll talk about in a minute, and you have to also designate your vet. Basically, it's a bit like when you register with a GP in France, you have to say, this is my vet that I am using. And the conditions that you need to fulfill do vary according to whether you're a professional or just an amateur. If you're a professional, you will need to prove that you've got at least 18 months professional experience before buying a horse, or that you're in possession of a diploma or a certificate on the list as decreed by the Arrêté Ministériel, which shows you've got sufficient knowledge to keep animals, or equids. Is it equids? God, I never know. And as you've probably noticed, I can barely speak English these days. I speak so much French that I think I talk in a general kind of franglais manner. But anyway, if you're a private individual, you need, in theory, to have a certificat d'engagement et de connaissance pour la détention d'une équide. Personally, and I'm not saying you should do this, ignore it, but I don't know anybody that keeps their horses at home that has got one of these, French or English or any other nationality for that matter. Now, you can get this certificate from a vet, or again, from a professional organisation, which is on the list, decreed by the minister, yet again, blah, 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 blah. And you need to sign it and write on it that you are going to understand and are aware of, and you're going to respect or stick to the psychological, behavioural and medical requirements of your animal. And this certificate specifies what these needs are, including transportation. I mean, it's basic stuff, food, water, shelter, blah, blah, blah. And it will also specify your obligations in terms of identifying and what they refer to in France as the traçabilité, of the animal in question, which is basically not letting it slip through the system. So it's all good in theory. In reality, it's yet another level of French paperwork that the vast majority of people tend to ignore. Bangs on the certificate, bangs on about the financial and logistical implications of having an animal and you having to meet their needs and blah, 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 blah for their whole life. All very good in theory, but we all know in reality, the people that don't look after their horses properly and neglect them are not going to be stopped by having a piece of paper. A bit of waste of time and money, in my humble opinion. You also need to declare whether you sell your horse or even pass it on without any money changing hands. You need to register the new owner and you need to declare its eventual death. Now, obviously, another question that comes up a lot is the importation process, and we haven't got time to get into that in this podcast, and it is quite complicated. Well, it's not that complicated, but it's just a lot of regulations to follow, paperwork to complete, etc., etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link to the importation process, the current importation process, because could change next week. I'll put a link in the show notes, and I would suggest if you are thinking about importing a horse and don't have anybody that's done it recently that you can chat to, take a look at that. And if you do have any questions, then get back to me. And if there's enough interest, we could do another podcast on it. Or if not, I'd be very happy to help you or advise on the process. Then we get on to the issue of finding a good vet. How do you find a good vet? Well, it's going to be a lot harder in a non-horsey area. And I was really lucky in Dax, which was not a particularly horsey area, because not too far there was a superb vet practice called Equidox. They then moved, so I did have to pay their travel time and a call out fee, but it was well worth it because they were absolutely brilliant. But it is a lot easier here in kind of Stud Farm Central, where I'm living now in Normandy, and I'm really lucky that the local vet's practice, which is only 6-7 kilometres away, is a specific equine practice, which is very, very good. So it's going to be a lot easier to find a vet if you live in a more horsey area, which is basically outside of Paris, Fontainebleau, Saumur and Normandy. Those are the big centres of equine activity in France. So the same, and obviously if you are living in an area where horsey vets are few and far between, I would take to the internet local horsey groups, whether they're Anglophone or French, on Facebook, ask around, ask people who do their horses properly, who do them in a manner that you do that, ask them who they use. That is the best way to find a decent vet. And the same problem comes up when it comes to finding decent feed. When I lived in Dax, I had two options, which was to driving to Pau or Mont-de-Marsan, which was 50 minutes either way. Now, both of these areas, though Les Landes itself isn't very horsey, there are racing yards in both Pau and Mont-de-Marsan, so there are better vets there and better feed store facilities. So if horses are a big part of your life and you have what I would refer to as proper horses or competition horses, basically thoroughbreds or warm bloods, or even elderly ponies that you need to be super careful with feed for, look at what's available, possibly even before committing to an area and buying a property, because not being able to get feed is a massive pain in the arse. And pre-Brexit, there were lots of people bringing in kind of Spillers, Dodson and Horrell, Baileys, stuff like that from the UK. Obviously, that is no longer doable, or even people doing, it's unofficially just shared carloads every now and again. All that kind of stuff used to happen quite regularly, and it's really dried up since Brexit. So if you are looking for British branded feed, which I completely understand because it is generally a lot better, or a specific product, you might want to investigate that before looking at the area that you're thinking about buying in. French horse feed has improved a lot from when we first arrived. I always remember when we very first moved here, I had to put my mare and a friend's thoroughbred mare and our two little ponies into the kind of French equivalent of a grass livery yard. And they threw whole beetroots, like betteraves, big ones, out in the field for the horses to chew on. And the first time it happened, I remember my thoroughbred mare just looking at me like, what the actual... what have you done to me, mother? Where is my stable? And why is some peasant throwing lumps of beetroot at me? And am I expected to eat them? And she never did, actually. Equally, I've discovered French horses don't generally like polos, which is really, really bizarre as well. You wouldn't think there would be a kind of national divide like that, but there is. Obviously, if you train and stay alive using polos, as I do with my deranged Spanish mare, You'll also need to ensure a decent supply of polos, whether those are smuggled in by your dad or friends when they come to visit, but sometimes they have them for sale in a chain of shops called Normal, but Normal are few and far between outside of big cities. So, all of these things, you need to factor it in. All right, the polo thing is a bit of a joke. You can give your horses bits of chopped up apple, but there is nothing like a polo for training purposes, I find. Anyway, French horse feed, still not great in general, and I've noticed a lot of colic in French yards where the horses are stabled because they are very often just fed what they call granulé, which is nuts. Not particularly great quality, and just nuts on their own, especially in that kind of setup where horses are all waiting to be fed and bolting feed because their friends banging on the door as well. It can and does lead to problems. Excuse me, I'm still slightly poorly. And I remember my mare choking once, and I had to call the vet out, which was entirely my fault because I'd fed her and another friend's mare in the field and not put them quite far apart enough. She ate the bloody pellets too fast. Vet call out, tubes, scopes, absolute flipping nightmare. So after that, until I could access some chaff, which took me bloody ages, I remember chopping up hay with scissors just so that I could have some fibre into her feed so she couldn't bolt it, because I was so panicked at the thought of it happening again. Her other question was, how do you find a good farrier if you're not dating one? Well, yep, that's ideal. Date a farrier and hope they're a good one. I would suggest using Facebook groups for Anglophones to find farriers because, again, when I came here, I was quite surprised initially at the differences. No trotting up afterwards if your horse has been shod to see how they're moving, or even if they haven't been shod. I had one bloke out years ago who was very rough and kind of abrupt with my mare, even though she was absolutely angelic for the farrier. So when I've got a 2.5-year-old now, and for his first farrier experience, I posted on Facebook groups in the area and found a really excellent guy who is in Brittany. I will put his details in the show notes as well in case anybody's in Brittany or Normandy. He comes up this way on a kind of 6-week rotation, and he has been brilliant with my youngster. Very kind, very gentle, firm, no nonsense, exactly what I wanted. But I did ask around and go for personal recommendations, so I really would recommend that you ask the kind of people, again, who do things the way that you do them, or and because some French farriers can be way too rough. And be nice to your farrier when you find a good one, because they are worth their weight in gold. Another question was about bugs and horseflies or mouches plats. Well, yeah, they're bloody enormous and they will make your life a misery. Now, everybody's got their own tried and tested method for dealing with these, and over the years I've tried most of them, including sunflower oil and white vinegar. I don't think it was at the same time, I think it was one or the other, but either which way, my horse just smelt of chips, and I can't really say it did anything particularly, and the sunflower oil was a nightmare to get off. The best product I've currently found is an Sheen roll-on, which I bought in Decathlon, and I use it all over myself and the horses, and it's easy to reapply. I also spray with either human or equine insect repellent, whatever I've got to hand, basically. All of my clothing, all of myself, numbness, anything. I kind of go out in a haze of fly spray and citronella. But the real way to deal with this is to get up early, like really early. As I said previously, when I lived in Dax and went riding with my friend Melanie, we would have to be out of the yard by 6:15. So you do need to go with a friend, I would say, because otherwise the motivation to get out of bed is quite tough sometimes. Livery yards, I've stayed away from them over the years. Again, they've improved a lot, and there are some sort of paddock paradise type equi welfare systems becoming better known, and they are yards like that where horses are free to move in and out on their own, and there's track systems. They are beginning to appear in France, but they're few and far between, and they cost a bomb. When my middle daughter, was doing her work experience at a kind of quite well-known riding school, boxes were mucked out twice a week, and all the horses from Shetlands to the 16-2s were all fed crushed corn, rice, and that was it. She had to turn them in and out alone, and during her work experience at the age of 15, it was chaos. It was badly run. It was tatty, the tack was dodgy, and that used to be the case for an awful lot of places. And things have improved. They've got a lot better, but I still don't think generally the standard of livery yards or riding stables in France is comparable to that of the UK. Now, many people move here and want to open a livery yard of their own, and so one of the questions is that doable? So yes, it is. You will, of course, need to register it as a business. You will need a SIREN or a SIRET number. And once you've got this official identification, you can set up shop offering livery, or as it's called in French, pension. Now, obviously, this is France. You're going to need to be insured. You need civil responsabilité civile professionnelle. So this will cover you in case any of your clients have an accident and make a claim against you. You will need a policy for the buildings and the equipment and any people that you employ. You'll need to insure them for workplace accidents. You will also need a diploma. Well, yes and no. You don't actually need a diploma to open a livery yard, but having one or any training course, whether it's a bac pro or a FFE, the Fédération Française d'Équitation qualification, will simplify your access to having what's known as agricultural status, which is very, very useful. We'll get onto that in a minute. It will also reassure your clients, and it will make accessing any grants or allowances much easier. So if you can possibly get your hands on a certificate or do a training course, I highly recommend it. Now, you don't need to produce your own hay, but if you want to become an agriculteur, it will help with your application, because if you don't produce your own hay or grow your own cereals to turn into horse feed, it will make being classified as having agricultural status, it will make that classification that bit harder. So again, there are ways, you can open a livery yard without having that farming status, but I highly recommend that you do. And you will need to make sure that if you have stables, les box, they're up to, required standards, they're big enough, there's enough ventilation, blah, blah, blah. Your paddocks are properly fenced. The same goes for shelters or tack rooms or shower rooms or grooming areas, drinking water. Basically, everything needs to comply to the appropriate norms so that you can say that you are aware of the well-being of the horses in your care and you are fulfilling all of the requirements to make sure that their well-being is absolutely attended to. Now, finding a suitable property. I do actually have one for sale currently, but fingers crossed it won't be for sale that much longer. But if anybody wants to get in touch after the show, feel free to ping me a message. Not joking aside, because it is actually for sale. But anyway, it's not that easy to find an agricultural property that's suitable, because you will need to check whether the land is allowed to be used for agricultural purposes. And then there is something called the SAFER, the SAFER, who have the right of preemption to any sale of any agricultural property with, I think it's over 1 acre of land in the whole of France. And they prioritise farmers, and particularly young farmers, which is why if you can possibly gain agricultural status and register under that, it will make life a lot easier. Now, obviously, in some areas, farming land is less sought after than others. But round here, it's like hen's teeth. You just can't buy agricultural land, and even farmers find it tricky. Other areas, it's a lot easier. So if you are living in an area where you think you might have problems buying, one workaround is to do what's called a bail agricole for the first 3 years, where a bail is a rental contract. So you do an agricultural rental contract with the owner of the land for 3 years, and then the Safair will make sure that you are the person that has first dibs on that land. So I've said that price and availability depends a lot on the area. I think here you could think out of the box and buy land that is not necessarily prime agricultural land. Think about woodland and track systems. Land isn't just lush green pastures, which is suitable, going to be suitable for the majority of equines. Maybe not picky thoroughbreds who will all stand just in the middle of the field eating the absolute nicest bit of grass and ignoring the rest. But if, for example, you have a Spanish mare like mine and a Pochock cross, they will eat brambles and bamboo and hedgerows and anything else they can get their hands on. They really don't need much grass at all. My mare is currently absolutely enormous. She looks more like a hippopotamus than a horse because she's been in a field with 3 racehorses all summer who've been given the best of grass to eat, and it's just too much for her. So think about your own personal requirements in terms of your own equines, even if you don't have any yet, the type of horses you like, the type you're going to have and keep, and think about if you could, for example, as I had in Dax, have a small amount of grazing land and quite a lot of woodland, which lent itself brilliantly to become a track system. And obviously I had to feed hay at times and in the summer, but workable and doable on quite a small acreage. I would also say that if you're horsey, the land is more important than the house, because you can always renovate or build, but if the land isn't right, you're stuffed from the outset. So do really investigate the land. Now, another question was about qualifications required to compete. And first thing to say here is that there is way more regulation in France than in the UK. There are no fun pony club local shows where you can come home with a rosette just for having the cutest pony or the best tail, apart from in some quite expatty areas where people have started running their own, setting up their own riding clubs, just like in the UK. So that is another thing to think about when thinking about your location. If that's something that you enjoy doing and you know you'd miss, then maybe look at one of those areas around, there's lots in the Dordogne around there where you will be able to do the kind of equestrian activities that you're used to doing rather than something that's much more French. You will need a license to ride in French riding schools or clubs or for leisure, or to take your exams, which are known as galops. And you can get this from the FFE, direct, or via your local riding school or stable. Probably easier, especially for a first application, to do it through your riding club or stable. And you will need this license if you want to take any of your gallo exams. And prior to Brexit, you could get an equivalence from the British Horse Society, but now, thank you Brexit, you can't. So you'll need to take them. Not that complicated, and it's a really good way to improve your French. You can buy the manual, sign up for a few lessons, and end up in a class with a load of 7 or 8 year olds who are all passing their galop 1 or 2, but then you will learn all the points of the horse, the parts of the saddle and the bridle in French. So it's a really good learning experience. And then if you want to compete at a kind of affiliate level in France, you will then have the qualifications that enable you to do so. Most French people take their galop exams and will tell you proudly that they're a galop 6 or 7. An awful lot of the Brits who've come to France, kind of my age, type of people who've ridden all their lives, not bothered, not fussed about competing in affiliate competitions, and, what's the point? So that's entirely up to you. And I think also the difference there with the sort of reglementation of riding and riding schools is it is part of the difference of French equestrian culture, which is very different to the background I was used to in the UK. And again, it has improved and moved on. I remember when we first came here, my farrier recounting that some of his clients would literally phone him in the spring and say, "Oh, the weather's getting better, I want to ride, come and put a set of shoes on my horse," or often just the front ones, so a set of shoes on my horse, and then they'd pretty much wait for them to all fall off before they called him back. You can imagine how much he loved that. And equally I saw people going out for a 20-kilometre ride and then loading their horses up in the lorry, leaving them in the heat whilst they went off for a 3-hour lunch. The first fun ride I did with my mare was not so much fun, because the first hill we came to, everybody bombed up it flat out, and the friend's 9-year-old that I was with, fell off because her pony bucked 3 times, obviously in a group it would do. And I was the only person that was sufficiently in control to stop, get off, pick the child up, put her back on her pony, and then remount. So they have improved, but I remember a couple of years ago, a friend wanted to take my then horse out on an endurance ride, and I said, look, there's a couple of fun rides down the road, and she said, oh, no. I'm going to do an FFE endurance qualification because those will be chaos. I haven't done a fun ride recently, so I can't tell you how good or otherwise they are, and I'm sure lots of people will be listening to this saying, oh, they're great, they're really well organised now. It depends. So just be aware, and it might not be quite as organised as you were expecting. The last couple of questions were about accessing hacking routes and farmers' attitudes to riding on their land. And again, this varies enormously. Some regions are better than others. They're full of trails and tracks, which are all signposted. We've just come back from the Morvan, which looked fab. Normandy's great. The Pays Basque was basically shit because there's barbed wire and fields of sheep everywhere. You just couldn't get from A to B. Excuse me. I am going to have to stop in a minute because I've been talking for too long and I'm going to start wheezing again. In terms of attitudes of farmers, befriend your local farmers and you should be fine riding in the area around your house. Only once in 20 years of riding in France did my daughter and I get stopped by somebody who came running out of their house. They were clearly quite crackers, and they told me they knew that horse riders came that way on a regular basis to case the joint and check out which houses were going to be suitable to be burgled. Now, as my kind of horse and my daughter's pony were spinning round on the spot and jogging sideways whilst he was telling this to think it was the winter and they were quite fresh, I thought to myself, I can think of easier ways if I was going to burgle somewhere than taking 2 deranged animals out for a spin first, but okay. So I just smiled politely and said yes, quite understood, and we'd stay off his field in the future. But I think generally if you stick to the edges and don't ride across the middle of somebody's bloody wheat field, you'll be fine. And if you do get stopped and somebody seems a bit off or grumpy about it, just apologise and be charming, and apologise for your rubbish French as well. That normally works. And the last one was about planning permission for stables, barns and arenas. And again, this depends enormously on the region, your property and local planning codes. Generally, it's nothing like as bad as the UK, and certainly in terms of the surface, putting track surfaces down and putting up field shelters that are quite discreet and nobody can see from the main road. I mean, I don't think anybody in France really gives a stuff about any of that. If you're in a more urban area, it's quite built up and the neighbours can see that you're putting your 30-metre stable block is going up in the garden, then obviously you need to dot the I's and cross the T's. But there are normally workarounds. In my previous property, in theory, we had 2 agricultural parcels of land and 1 residential, and we couldn't put a field shelter, if I remember correctly, on the agricultural bit, but we could put up a shelter. Thank you to the nice lady in the planning office. And because I used an architect in the end, because it was getting complicated with where exactly this building was going to be located, and that did cost me about €600 just for him to do the drawings and draw exactly what he knew would get through in that particular region, I got permission for a 40 square metre stable block / field shelter / tack room / hay store. So unless you're buying somewhere which is within the site of a historic building or chateau and it's protected, development rights all around it, generally it's okay. But again, it's something to check out, like the land usage as well as the soil type, before you sign on the dotted line. So I hope that's been useful. I hope it's not been too long. I hope it's given you some pointers and tips. And again, I've really skimmed over an awful lot of the subjects here because it is a massive subject and there's lots of rules and regulations. So I just wanted to give you a kind of overview. But basically, yeah, there are loads of rules, but it's all quite doable. Don't panic. If I can do it, and if I did it 20 years ago, coming to France with 1 horse and 2 ponies, that I had no working spoken French at the time, nowhere to put them really, I managed. It's doable. So good luck. Or tally ho, and thank you for listening. I'll be back with a couple of other quite interesting episodes coming up that I've got in the pipeline. In the meantime, thank you as always to our fabulous sponsors, Fab French Insurance, who will make your life in France as simple as Frenchly possible. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next time.